In your work, you've talked about this a number of times, about right from the beginning, from the 2468 house and Kate Mentolini, about surfacing new meanings out of an existing fabric of a city, as you did with Kate Mentolini, and reinterpreting those meanings. It seemed to be very interesting to you, taking the fabric and finding new meanings in it.
I've always been interested in the middle ground, because you'd never say our work is modernist in the sense of being completely other, or is positing a position of detachment, or of an avant-gardism, which is intentionally rejecting the status quo, and at the same time, meaning that it's connected to, it's attached, it's interested in historical conditions, in the culture and the cultural, political, economic, social reality of those conditions. But it's not, historicism would also be complete disinteresting, it's littleness, it's complete lack of an ability to develop interpretive data, which is this essential to any kind of creative process, which has to be free and open and not closed, which history is, because it's finished, because it's past us. But finally, it's neither of these. It's a middle ground which is able to capture aspects of what exists, which is the grounding material of architecture. And I would say for myself that one of the things that gives me continual inspiration in terms of how to kind of push a model into yet another project is to be conscious of the specifics and the idiosyncratic nature that always comes to you from a new project, which is always different. You look out of the window and all we're trying to do is you're producing a work and it has something to say in some way about what we're observing. And what we're observing is immediate, and it's kinetic, and it's changing, and it's definitely uncertain. Nobody could agree on anything. And the notion is then, well, how does one kind of operate that way within the static requirement of a form? But that's, luckily, we weren't the first ones to have to ask that question, because we're 3 generations at least afterwards, so that we've studied Malevich, we've read Duchamp, we can continue that discussion. And so we go, well, we already know that Duchamp only drew all the motion, and that was an interesting idea. Well, and Leger and Picasso and Braque were onto that one. And we're going, well, we didn't enter the world, for them, different story. They truly entered this world where they were at the moment of invention, of this huge shift, right?
Don't you think?
And we're already down the line.
Don't you think in architecture it's only recently, particularly in work like yours, that the same quality that you described has been rendered in architecture? Because modernism itself didn't render it.
No,
neither does postmodernism.
Absolutely.
I mean, your work is beginning to try and render that quality in architecture, which is the most difficult medium of all.
Right. Dealing with
uncertainty,
dealing with part, dealing with fragment, dealing with armature, intentional. This idea of intentionally not finishing, but then again, even that discussion could come from several directions. It's an old adage, whether it's a child or adult, that the most interesting building is always the one under construction. And you'd always, and architects for sure, I'm sure we could be going around town and say exactly the same thing. You look at something and you're going, oh, just end it right now, right? And it's in some state of a finish. And in many cases, it would actually, it's true if you're kind of more interesting, sans decoration and kind of the layering of things people have to do to it. And a lot of things that are taking place are somehow intentional or unintentional accidents, or they're just taking place out of some process. And you would go, ooh, you're there. But it's also raw. It's also it's alive with energy. And I think the reason that the public would so much, the way a child would stop and look at it, it's interesting because of that kind of rawness. But it's interesting because it absolutely recalls kind of the activity of making it. And finally, it seems like somehow the process, the activity of making this thing, especially as architecture gets larger and bigger, and it's getting more kind of intriguing of getting a big heavy thing way in the air, and the relationships of the numbers of parts and the complexity. And when it hasn't been kind of spoiled by some need to kind of bury this stuff, you still see the cables and the elevators, you see the transformer, and all these things that in normative society is ugly, or it's not interesting, and you're going, well, maybe beauty then or ugliness isn't that even shouldn't be operational. I'd say those are totally unoperational ideas, because I'd always leave the transformer because I think it's interesting. And the discussion should be, is the building more or less engaging? Or the question should be a whole dialogue of how do we establish a parameter of what buildings should or shouldn't be visually in terms of their usefulness to society. We're here to produce resistance, and we should be actually rated by our resistance, and resistance which is useful as another voice. And so there's one person, and it's this, in this case of the school, it's the state, and they say it has to be built for this much money, and that's their role. You need that person. There's another person that says it has to do this, this, and this, and it's in a prescribed set of rooms for education, and that's the school district, and you need that person. There's a contractor that's going to tell you how I can build it and not make a leak, and you have to have that person. And then there's an architect, and he doesn't have to agree with any of those people. It's a fourth voice. And the voice is saying, well, why don't we look at this in terms of, and it's the generalist, why don't we look at this in terms of opportunity or potentiality? So when we started that school, I had absolutely no interest in stylistic ideas, no interest in direct architectural ideas, absolutely zero interest in the program, but the program is generic. It's the same program I went to school with, and the same school every school in the country is, to begin with, give or take an auditorium, a swimming pool, right? They're literally generic programs, and of question mark. What is the job here? And we took on just a broad idea. The one was to change the psychology of the place into one thing to another thing. And my notion was that the school system today, and to ask whether to define an architect's role in that problem. How can we participate in education as architects? What can we contribute to the equation? And it was our belief here that the physical plant, the physical edifice of the school itself, could absolutely challenge the norm of what people think that place is. And if you look at, say, the normal school in California, you wouldn't be too impressed. If you were looking for some corollary, oh, it's strange. Just about a prison would be just about the closest thing you could name if you're just looking for very overt physical references. Chain link fence maybe with barbed wire. Absolutely generic kind of rectilinear buildings, just about windowless, or trailers, even worse. And you'd go, wow, if you're an anthropologist looking back 300 years and you discovered the site and you were trying to figure out what was happening in there, and then you finally decided through your investigation it was a school, you would be fascinated. You'd probably surmise, or it wouldn't be unreal to think that, well, this is a kind of an interesting place for people to learn, and this is what it means. This society thought that this place should be, right? It discusses the values of that society. Anyway, we tacked at that level, and we said, versus the program, not much room, given program, not a whole lot of room to move that in terms of just bureaucratic, legislative kind of issues. What can we do? And we're going to change the big picture. And what we're interested in doing, and we don't care whether you like it or don't like it as a building. Could care less. I like blue, you like red, you like yellow. Not important. I want something square, I want something round. We understand that. When you see this thing, is it possible that it opens up a potential? Because my notion was, and I remember being, I grew up in a tough, poor neighborhood. Mother raised me, poor. I can remember, like it was yesterday, times when it was just really, really tough to live. And you go to these schools and they're absurd places. Don't want to be there. Tried not to be there. I was a kid that cut as many days as I could when I was a kid, always getting in trouble. Why would you want to be there? They're horrendous places to be at every level. I wanted a place that when somebody went there, you can do, the feeling was, I can do anything I want to do. The world is open to me. I'm a young person still, and part of it's my obligation, and this institution is going to remind me that I can do anything. So when you're looking at these pieces that turn, things that might not look functional, it actually is just about all functional. The notion was, I was hoping that they'd look at that and they would recognize that it's not normative.
You're challenging the presumptions.
It's interested in dreaming, it's interested in invention, it's interested in literally breaking the box in this case, a literal sense, breaking the box. And I'm in telling them I'm I'm proselytizing just about as overtly as I can as an architect. I'm pleading with them just about that do what you want to do and follow your own heart, and you can believe in ideas and you can build them. And then when I can talk to them, because when you do this process, you know as an architect, that's always the case. One group says you can't do it, you can go right through these same group, I can't afford it, it'll leak, it doesn't work, all these things. And I go, well, don't get too upset about that, because that's normal. That's what architects do, and people don't talk about that about, but they want to know about architects artistically and all that. But by the way, what you really have to do is you have to believe in something enough that to actually accommodate, to actually be strong enough, and to be articulate enough and knowledgeable enough to solve those problems. And to be just a dreamer isn't going to get you into reality, because finally architecture starts with a vision, a dream, an aspiration, a desire, and it's married with realities. And if you can't marry the realities, you're not an architect. And so the second part of the discussion is don't make it leak, make it affordable, make it in materials that last 30 years, make it work programmatically, and not only programmatically, give them the auditorium back, give them the music studio back. We gave them programs back through our strategy and added to the program using the same requirements. So the idea was not only to solve it well, we're going to add to it and put pieces back in the program that they have no longer, which will come out of our strategy of the land form. And in the end, it's like, then I can go back and say, don't tell me you can't do it. Don't tell me you can just dream and you can't do it, because that's what the building represents. And going all the way back to your discussion of how do you manage the limits of concretization. So now I'm saying, okay, yes, versus film, to be able to articulate time, space, materiality, gravity, etc. You can do some really fascinating things, right? Architecture, you might say more limited. I would say not more limited, just a different sphere. Things are frozen a bit, but can you kind of talk about these broad ideas? I would ask as a question back, and the building you're talking about, I would ask, well, does it imply openness? Does it imply movement in a broader sense, or kinetic in a broader sense? Does it do what I'm hoping or saying it does? And then that's finally the litmus test, whether I'm full of bullshit or what I'm doing, what I'm saying I'm doing. And that's why critics like yourself are needed. That's what you do, right? Keep us honest, or add to that equation.
How much do you think the nature of Southern California, of Los Angeles, plays into this quality of both of challenging and the uncertainty, the fluidity, if you like, transparency, as you talked about?
Huge. Huge. LA, because it lacks a in-place culture. It lacks a
ruling mode.
Doesn't have, it doesn't, that's what I need. The word is to be a ruling or a predominant. Like a New York, like a San Francisco, like a Boston, like a Philadelphia, all the cities you name. You can go into a default, it represents a default mode. And I think, same guys you would name, Neutra, Schindler, Wright, it's been like that since its beginning, and it's beginning all the way, it was only 100 years ago, so you're looking at a village still, a huge, huge village that's still in formation. Actually what's taking place, I think, with the institutions right now represents kind of a moving towards a more conventional city as it starts building its institutions, this collective culture, which is still in formation, but which seems to be a huge number happening right now. No, because then it allows architects to kind of utilize, if they're interested in that, this openness, this lack of a singular configuration of culture, and it produces probably both the best and the worst out of that, because it's default, because it doesn't have rules, and of course architecture, I don't think any architect would tell you, I certainly wouldn't, that finally architects operates best under rules. And so it's those people that are best at kind of establishing rules within this kind of total freedom, which requires, but you couldn't do that if you were always struggling.
But in a more subtle sense, it requires each architect to invent himself out of his own gut, rather than from some existing...
Right. And as you know, LA is in terms of the practices, is an immensely private place. When I'm in New York and talk to my friends there, everybody knows everybody, everybody's kind of looking at everybody. There's this complete connected thing, and some of it's quite lovely, and it allows for a certain kind of communication. Some of it is not quite so lovely, and people are kind of right on top of each other, and it's a little bit cutthroat at times. In LA, of course, it's I think it's also been like this, and even as the city gets larger and gets more and more architects, all of us, this studio kind of represents typical no address, no front, can't find it, and now I've done it long enough where I wanted people to find it. I obviously would have done it. I've been practicing for 30 years, but you realize that's how you're comfortable. You're comfortable in this. You kind of hide away in your own city, and Frank does the same. Here we are, Frank. We're a block away, and I see him at a music event. We might have breakfast someplace. I think I've been to his office maybe once every 5 years. I'm not sure he's ever been here. You never leave here. Then if our boss is hidden away over in a place that's even harder to find, right? And you say that about all of the offices here, and it's I agree, and it's very much also connected to a kind of an idea of autonomy.
As a final question, where do you see yourself going in this context, in this process?
Leanne, I live for the moment. As I guess expected, I'm 58 years old, and all of a sudden the practice has changed considerably, and I have large-scale projects and quite a few of them, and I have a considerably larger office than I've had in the past.
One might say your work has become increasingly sophisticated over the years, in the sense of...
It's supposed to happen. That's good to hear from you. It's
Well, you know more. You seem to know more certainly what you're doing.
I don't feel that way. I always feel very uncertain, but I think I'm more comfortable in the larger scale work. I think I was more prepared, and maybe that goes back to my earlier training and my earlier interests, starting with urban design and planning, and then later starting again from a micro level and material. And I feel much more prepared, or I like the mixture of being able to argue something at a larger level, like we talked about at the school, where I can deal in something I can believe in. When I'm working on a chair, we're doing our cafes or a house, it's much more difficult to find the broader issues of which you can establish a platform and you can argue for and believe in. And the work is much more within the autonomy of architecture, within its artistic act. And there's nothing wrong with that. And it's something that I absolutely admire and enjoy, and et cetera. But I think with the work now, it energizes me in a different way. And that I feel that there's an intersection between the political act and the creative act. And then I can argue it. The artistic act, which I've always had difficulty arguing, I don't have to talk about. It's more or less private, or it just comes as a response to the broader aspirations of the work. And what I can argue is the discourse is centered around the broader issues of a project. And so, for instance, with the school, I can immediately try to diffuse it and say, look, I know we can't agree on this, and we can't agree on this. What you have to do is just believe in me that I can deliver on the first package, and that it will be engaging. And that even the notion of aesthetics you're going to find is quite both ephemeral and is quite complicated, and it's something that you didn't like today, you might come to actually adore a year from now, and it's going to be very much connected to your knowledge of it and your connection to whether it fulfills the first set of aspirations, right? And you might decide, well, this thing looks better than I thought it looked because it's actually doing certain things that I've never thought about, and now I see it differently because your understanding of something is so much connected to your perception of something aesthetically, and it's something that, of course, in this country too is extremely difficult because we live in a culture which is still in its early formation in terms of a visual world and a cultural world, because you could probably say the same thing in music, right? And that in not the same case, maybe, say, if you find in Europe or even in Japan, which is where this dialogue at a public level has a pedigree, right? And that there's kind of an understanding of this at a different level. And here it's like the LA scene again. You're nurturing this, and where you're going to be as much a teacher as you are an architect at some point, but you have to be able to really kind of articulate the nature of these formations of new things, and especially if you see your job as always producing things that you haven't seen, right? That you can anticipate that you're always going to get more or less the same answer. It's odd because I haven't seen it, and of course you haven't seen it because that's what I'm doing here, right? And but I think that the connectivity between, I think that the essential thing is that to produce architecture finally is that you have to be able to connect it to kind of its broader aspirations, and they have to be grounded within a discourse which could be clarified. And then I think it brings the more difficult discussion of the aesthetic, meaning that we understand that that to start with, the aesthetics aren't prioritized on some abstract idea, that they in fact are from their beginning somehow connected, and that all we're looking at is, and they all are coherent, and all we're looking at is different sets of logic, because that's how I go about trying to explain it. I start with not physiognomic or explaining how it looks. I try to describe that you're looking at something and you're looking at a system of logic, and the first thing you want to do is understand or participate with us in understanding what that logic system is that got you there. And now we can talk about the more specific nature of its engendered effects, what you're seeing, right? The effects of this logic, right? And you want to go back and describe why one thing is solid, one thing is transparent, one is translucent, right? If it has color, what the color means, on and on, right? The best you can, knowing that that's impossible. Finally, that if you're doing a job, that finally there's a sense of that you cannot ever describe. Is immediate, and it's kinetic, and it's changing, and it's definitely uncertain. Nobody could agree on anything. And the notion is then, well, how does one kind of operate that way within the static requirement of a form? But that's, luckily, we weren't the first ones to have to ask that question, because we're 3 generations at least afterwards, so that we've studied Malevich, we've read Duchamp. We can continue that, because modernist in the sense of being completely other, or is positing a position of detachment, or of an avant-gardism, which is intentionally rejecting the status quo, and at the same time, meaning that it's connected to, it's attached, it's interested in historical conditions, in the culture and the cultural, political, economic, social reality of those conditions, of what exists, which is the grounding material of architecture. And I would say for myself that one of the things that gives me continual inspiration in terms of how to kind of push a model into yet another project is to be conscious of the specifics and the idiosyncratic nature that always comes to you from a new project, which is always different. You look out of the window and all we're trying to do is you're producing a work, and it has something to say in some way about what we're observing. And what we're observing is, but it's not, historicism would also be complete disinteresting, it's littleness, it's complete lack of an ability to develop interpretive data, which is this essential to any kind of creative process, which has to be free and open and not closed, which history is, because it's finished, because it's past us. But finally, it's neither of these. It's a middle ground which is able to capture aspects.
In your work, you've talked about this a number of times, about right from the beginning, from the 2468 house and Kate Mentellini, about surfacing new meanings out of an existing fabric of a city, as you did with Kate Mentellini, and reinterpreting those meanings. It seemed to be very interesting to you, taking the fabric and finding new meanings in it.
I've always been interested in the middle ground, because you'd never say our word